Good morning. Here we are again discussing this vast topic of Indian literature in the 21st century. And again, we don't know where to begin. But right now, we are to focus on translations. India, as you know, is a land of many languages, and translations are not only necessary, translation runs in our veins. We translate continuously while talking, while thinking also perhaps. And without translations, it would probably be very difficult to understand not just each other but also ourselves in India, considering India is such a multicultural, multilingual, dynamic country. But it's not just India, it's also South Asia that has this identity as a multilingual, complex cultural space. And I'm delighted today to have three eminent writers and translators from South Asia. Musharraf, and of course everybody knows Arvind Krishna Malhotra, and Adneja from Kashmir. So we shall start, I think, with, what should we start with? Let's start with each talking about why they translate, what they translate, for maybe 2 minutes, and then we'll get into our discussion about translation in general. Musharraf, you have actually, you're a creative writer as well as a translator, and you have translated from Urdu, and you've translated from medieval Urdu, right? As well as contemporary Urdu. So why could you just talk about why?
I started translating sometime in early 1990s. I have a friend of Zalam Sayyed who's a poet, and I consider him Urdu's greatest living poet. And we became friends, and I absolutely loved his poetry, and I thought that I'd like to try, because it's considered inaccessible to other languages, as he's considered inaccessible to other languages as a poet, because he has a particular kind of expression. So I decided, just for my own ego boosting, that I'm going to translate it and make it in English, and then I have proved myself as a translator. So I mean, that was just this childish thing, but I really loved his poetry. Then I translated all of it. So that was my first start. Actually, even before I started writing in English, I was translating. The other thing that I translated is The Adventures of Amir Hamza, which is Dastan-e-Mir Hamza, a classical legend or epic, as you would call it. And it comes in two traditions. One is a one-volume tradition, a single-volume tradition, which starts with the life with the birth of Amir Hamza, who's a mythical character in this book, but it's based on Prophet Muhammad's uncle of the same name. And at the end of this legend, or at the end of this book, which is about 1,000 pages in English translation, he dies, and the legend ends there. But then there is a different Dastan-e-Mir Hamza tradition, which is the Amir Hamza cycle, and it comprises 46 volumes, each of about 1,000-page length in Urdu. And if you translate from Urdu into English, the language expands. So what is 1,000 pages in Urdu becomes 1,500 pages in English. So I was trying to translate a stand-alone fantasy from within this cycle, because this cycle comprises of different parts, different stand-alone fantasies. And there's one particular fantasy, Dilis Mein Khosh Hua, which I really loved and which I read as a child. So I decided to translate that. And because it was 1,000 pages, the first volume, I decided to break it down into 3 volumes. So the first volume has come out, and it's called Khosh Hua, The Land and the Listen, which was published by Random House here. So these are the 2 things that I translate. Then there's a small Urdu novella called Nambardar Kanila, which is by an Indian Urdu writer, Sayyid Muhammad Ashraf. He's Aligarh based, and I translated that into English. So these are the 3 things that I translated.
Okay. So yeah, that's a lot actually. So you've been translating contemporary literature as well. You've also translated contemporary poetry.
That's right.
Yeah, so we'll come to that shortly. So there are 4 things as far as I can make out. 3 things. Okay. Okay, you're clubbing Hoshruba and Amir Hamza together.
Yes.
Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah, Arvind. You have been, of course, one of our most prominent writers in any language, and of course you write in English. And you have also been extremely involved in the modernist movement, so to speak, in Indian literature. So when you translate, and you have translated from, you've translated Kabir, and you've translated a lot of medieval poetry. So why did you start translating, and what do you feel about that?
Yeah, just a couple of things about why, how one translates. I started writing in the mid-1960s, 1965, 66. And around 1967-68, my friend Adil Jasawala, he was commissioned to do new writing in India by Penguin. And when I say Penguin, I don't mean, Penguin India. I mean this thing we had all dreamt of all our childhood and all our adolescence, which is Penguin UK. So it was. So Adil said he's been asked to edit this anthology. He wanted some translations from the Hindi. So I did Gupta, I did Dhumil, Dudnath Singh, Gyan Ranjan, I did their short stories. That was my first introduction, and I realized that I live in a Hindi-speaking area in Allahabad, which I still do. And I'm writing poems, but I also have this other language right there, which I can translate from. So that was my first, and I was 19, 20 years old when I did those translations. My next bunch of translations came when Arun Kulatkar was reading the Gahakoso. This is when you talk of modernism and my role in modernism, when I read the Gahakoso, I realized that modernism is at least 2,000 years old. It certainly begins, and when I say 2,000, I actually mean maybe 3,000 years old, because some of these poems, we don't know the earliest forms. This is in Prakrit in Maharashtra. They are 2-line poems, and they are about the most remarkable poems I've ever read on a woman's sexuality. So Arun was reading it in this incredible Marathi edition. There was no way that I could read it, because it gave the Prakrit, it gave the Maharashtra, it gave the Sanskrit, and it gave the Marathi. So I was completely shut out of these incredible poems. For instance, I'll just give you 2 or 3 poems that Arun read out, which led me. These are 2-line poems in the Gatha form, and these are all sexual dramatic situations. So the mother telling the daughter, "Don't cry, child. The village where you are going, you will find the Godavari, you will find the cane growing, and you will find the go-between." All the mother is telling the daughter is, you can continue your affairs after you get married. So what's the problem in getting married? You know, all the 3 things you need. You need the river, you need camouflage, and you need a go-between. Or the mother telling the daughter, this is 2,500 years old. The mother, and these are 2 lines, and the mother telling the daughter, I can probably explain it easier in Hindi, that sometimes, child, if you can't find another man, you'll have to sleep with your husband. Now, this utter grief of, now, if a mother is advising her daughter 2,500 years ago, and there are 700 poems in the Gahakoso, one after the other. There are any number of poems about the woman on top position, a pregnant woman trying to mount a husband. And it just goes on relentlessly for those 900 poems. So when I looked at that, I realized that there is no way that I could let this go. And so I translated that. And Kabir is something I had been translating for a long time, till I finally found the American idiom in which to translate Kabir.
the American idiom?
Well, the American idiom, because I realized we don't have an Indian idiom. So that we can discuss that forever, but you can't translate anything into this beast called Indian English. So it's a little bit totally incomprehensible to the rest of the world. So we don't have a register. And that's it. That is a problem. When we discuss the problems of translation, we will certainly have to take this on board. How do we translate conversation? How do we translate the spoken idiom? Different poets have found different ways. Arun Kulatkar got the American idiom. He latched on to the American idiom. That was his way of translating the spoken idiom. So taking that route, I did translate it into that, that's the anyway.
And how did you translate from Prakrit?
Well, it's my firm belief that you should only translate from languages which you don't know, because having just translate from the
that
language.
That makes sense, yes.
Yeah, it's a huge handicap to know the language, because then you wrap yourself with all kinds of problems. So what I even for that to be, I can't read medieval Hindi, and I certainly can't read Maharashtrian. So, but there are ways of doing it. For instance, in both the Prakrit and the Kabir, you find cribs, you find dictionaries, you find other translations. And for the Prakrit, to be fair, I had a Sanskrit tutor, a student. But the problem there was all the verses are erotic, and he refused to translate a lot of them for me. So he was 19, 20 years old, और नहीं sir, वो तो ऐसे ही कुछ है उसमें. I said, क्या है उसमें? Then I had to go to the Sanskrit professor. So what I'm saying is, without knowing Maharashtra, the Asiatic Society had a book which was a crib by Basak. So that gave a literal word for word translation. Then so basically through Basak and through the Sanskrit tutor, I was able to gather the Prakrit.
Neerja, you bring out this magazine in English from Kashmir. It's a magazine about Kashmiri literature and culture. And you do a lot of translations also into English, right? So how did you, tell us a bit about, in 2 minutes, tell us a bit about your magazine and your translations.
Actually, the magazine has come much later. I started translating, actually the real reason was in the early 90s. It seemed that Kashmir was doomed, and it had launched itself on a path of complete destruction, and there was a desire to save something, And I have been very much impressed by the short story writers of Kashmiri who were hardly known outside Kashmir. But we used to enjoy their short stories very much. They were perfect as far as technique was concerned, and the kind of concerns they were dealing with it was something which we could relate to. So I started translating those short stories with this intention that let the rest of the world also know what is happening in Kabul. Everything is not destroyed, but there are people who are thinking, who are sensitive. And also, you see, the desire was to let the people know that a language, Kashmiri, exists. Because I had a funny experience. I had come for a seminar to Delhi. I used to teach actually. And there was a senior professor of Delhi University. When I talked about that we speak Kashmiri, he said, is that a language? We have heard of Dogri, but we haven't heard of Kashmiri. And it came as a shock to me because Dogri is spoken by very few people in the state of J&K.
But those people happen to be Hindus. So.
No, yes. But we are Hindus and we speak Kashmiri also. And Kashmiri is part of the Chenab district also, they speak, not only in the valley. So that was my main desire. And the magazine happened because, again, from this desire to preserve something of Kashmiri culture, our heritage, because people seem to have forgotten it. Because Kashmir had a very syncretic way of life, and there was hardly any difference between Hindu and Muslim. Hindus were a very small minority, and they existed peacefully, and the magazine was a result of that. And then also my desire to translate from Kashmiri women poets. who start from the 14th century onwards. And I thought that some of them had been translated before, but my favorite English proverb is, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. But I thought that I should tread that path, because I thought that I could do, maybe I could at least try to do better, not definitely better, but something sound a little better than. Because you see, these two languages, Kashmiri and English, have been a part of my life from when I learned to speak, and I'm comfortable in both. And I thought, as Musharraf Saab said, that I can do it. So later on, if there is time, I would like to read a couple of barks of Lal Ded, which have been translated earlier, and how I have translated. If you permit.
Well, do you want to do that now? And we can, because then we can move on to talking about, but we started late, so we can't take too long.
See, the problem,
It's just that it's interesting, which is fine. Maybe we can ask you to translate from Konkani, some Konkani poets, if you're there. But I also actually translate, and I sometimes translate from languages I don't know. That's true, but that is because I work with a translator who's a native speaker of that language. So, and theory gets in the way of practice far too often. So you just have to go ahead and... So yeah, please, Nitya, if you could read.
actually, see, Lal Ded has been, you are all familiar with the name of Lal Ded. Actually, she was a great 16th century, and she wrote in barks, and they are sometimes rhymed, sometimes they aren't, which is better for us. And in any case, I wouldn't even attempt to rhyme in English. The difficulty here is not only the language, but to capture that elusive, mystical experience with... should I bring it closer? Can you hear me? Yes. See, I was talking about her use of... actually, first of all, the difficult task is accomplished by the poet herself when she is communicating something to us which is actually uncommunicable, because this is a spiritual experience which she has had. But because she does it through these graphic metaphors and images, I thought that if I could capture that, that might give an idea. So fortunately, nobody here will know Kashmiri, but at least the sounds might. Oh, Jamil Saab is there. He'll understand. Okay.
Okay. If it's very long, then perhaps you could just read a couple of lines.
This is just the 4 lines. Damadam kurmas daman hale, prazilyom deep tnaneyam zaat, andrim prakash never chotum, gatimaz rotum tkurmas thap. The bellows pipe I pressed, muffling its breath. The lamp lit, in its radiance I stood revealed. I let the inner light burst out into the open, through the darkness caught hold of him and would not let go. This had been done earlier, I don't want to compare, but I thought that I could probably capture the essence from a woman's point of view also, because the other translations that have been done are mostly by men, and right from the time of the 19th century, Grierson, Englishman who learned Kashmiri, and then he tried to do it, but they were more explanatory kind of translations. And some of them are transcreations also, where people think that they can do a better job of the poetry than the poet has done herself, which I can't presume to do. So I just wanted to give you an example.
Thank you very much for that. But then you bring up a very interesting point. How much of the poet can we actually hope to retain in the translation? And when does a translation cease to be a translation and become a transcreation, really? Or are all translations transcreations?
I would like to say that I try to be as faithful to the text as possible. In fact, I don't believe in transcreation, because I think that if you want to do that, you should be a poet yourself and write in whatever language you like. And there are people who are taking such liberties with the text of our lyric poets like Haba Khatun, whose name you might have heard, and Ernimal. And I realized that people are seeing more meaning in the poem than is intended.
Perhaps necessary. Yeah. Arvind, what do you feel about it? Because sometimes there is, of course, this new trend of saying that every translation is actually a new text.
Yeah, okay. I'll quickly, instead of answering the question, I'll just give you a parable which I came across in Ramanujan, one of Ramanujan's essays. I think it's called On Translating a Tamil Poem. He ends with the parable of the Chinese emperor who asked his engineers to build a tunnel through a mountain. Is anyone familiar with this parable?
Yes.
So, a few people would have read this parable. And if all of you know, then I won't mention that.
Please go ahead.
So what happened? So Ramanujan gave this example as what happens in translation. So you take from both sides, ends of the tunnel, and you meet in the middle. So that is what a translation does. You dig from one end, you dig from the other end. But then the emperor asks, what happens if you don't meet in the middle? So then the engineer said, then we have two tunnels. See, basically what you have the original and you have another poem called the translation. So if they meet, that's nice. If they don't meet, you have two poems. So what are you complaining about? That's what I've always. You do your best. You hope that they will meet. There will be some connection between what you. But if they don't, they don't. Then you have two poems.
What about you? Are you more interested in two poems, or are you more interested in, like Nidja, being faithful to the original?
I'm lucky in the sense that Urdu poetry I've translated are all living poets. So whatever I translate, I send it back to them, and then they authorize. It's just an authorized version of their work, and if it doesn't work, then it's their responsibility because. But that being said, I'd like to come back to what Mr. Mehrotra said about the register in which we translate, and the Indian register, or the register native to the foreign register native to the language, which is the source language. And speaking of Urdu, from which I translate, there are other languages like Arabic and Persian, which are also written in this script. And both these languages, Arabic and Persian, have received a lot of interest. Their classics have been, to a great extent, translated into English by native Englishmen. So they have created a register for translation from those languages. So anybody working now from classical Persian or classical Arabic has ready access to that register, which it can he or she can change or adopt or do what with. In Urdu, we did not have this tradition. There were very few texts translated during the 19th century and early 20th century. And they had a particular purpose, to acquaint the officers of the East India Company with the way we think and speak and so on and so forth. But we, from the oral tradition, we did not have any narrative text, which the Dastan is. It's been transcribed from the oral tradition by the Dastan narrators themselves. So I thought it was a challenge in that respect, that to find an equivalent language which captures the mood of the original. So whatever the struggle is, at least it's one attempt, and there could be other attempts.
Okay, so we started late, so I'm actually going to go on for another 10 minutes, which will give us exactly half an hour from when we started, which is our time. Before we open it to the audience, yeah, that's correct, right? All of you who are keeping time. Okay. When we talk about translating living poets, that of course is a different thing, because then you do have somebody to go back to, and even very often what we have seen, we do a lot of translations in the Little Magazine from various South Asian languages, and very often the original author or poet is not actually even interested in the English translation. Very interested that the English translation come out, but is not really interested in reading it. So he or she will say, yes, go ahead, publish it, you have my blessings, without even reading it. That does not actually mean that the translation is as authentic as we might wish to believe. But then does it really matter if it is not? The fact is, how much of the translation should be, the original author just translated literally, and how much of it should be a creative text which reads well in the target language. So that is a balance that I think all translators need to.
Should I try and answer that for in 1 minute? I'll just give again. You see, there is the example of Singer, Isaac Bashevis Singer. He was writing in Yiddish, and there were very few Yiddish speakers left in the world when he was writing. He went over his English translations with a fine comb, because these are his words. He said this is the master tape from which it will be translated into all other languages. People are not going to translate from the Yiddish into Japanese, but they're certainly going to translate from the English. So it's extremely stupid of these people who know the language not to look at those translations. Well, if they don't know, that's a separate issue, but to know the language and then not to go over those translations. Now, there are the Borges is another example, who knew English perfectly well, and he actually, he said his English translations read much better sometimes than the Spanish, because he was able to go over those poems, and he said, this is what I was trying to say. I actually was thinking in English and writing in Spanish. Now I can put it back into English because that is how I was thinking about this moment. Arun Kolatkar, when he translated his Marathi poems into English, the few of them, he made radical changes in them. And so sometimes in one poem that he adds an extra stanza which is not there in the original. So all I'm trying to say is that, the English translation, if people are careful about it, people who translate their own work can take any liberties they want. I mean, obviously, translators, whatever I say, I'm being half facetious. But the truth is that you cannot take the liberties that the original author said. But certainly, if you are reading a translation, if you know the language, then I think the author should look at the translation.
No, that's a question of should. But what happens is that half the times they don't know English well enough, even if they do, because in a colonized country like ours and yours too, I mean, it's. We do know English to a certain extent, but that doesn't mean that we can actually understand enough to, especially when you are translating from languages, from authors actually who may be in villages, who may not have had any English training, so they don't really have an option. So you have to stand in and actually take responsibility for what you're putting out there. And of course, Arun Kolatkar can keep changing his own poetry, but we can't. We can't change most of the things that we translate. But we do leave out. I mean, this is something that I do. I don't know whether you will agree. I mean, I have this motto which was taught to us as a journalist, which was, when in doubt, leave out. And I often do that when I'm translating. I mean, maybe not huge chunks, but maybe a word here or a phrase there, when I'm not quite comfortable or happy with the translation. Would you also do that? Or?
Well, I'll tell you, I'll give it to you from Kabir. Now, if you're translating Kabir, a lot of it is actually rubbish. This is because it is just formulaic oral poetry. And so they have the same images over and over again. You look at a whole range of bhakti poetry, and a lot of it just does not go down in modern American idiom. So you obviously leave out a lot. But in the Kabir tradition, the scribes, whenever they didn't like something, they left those things out in any case. So each verse has half a dozen, starting with Shite Mohan Sen's edition, one of the early editions with Amartya's grandfather. Yeah. So starting with that, he was looking at the oral tradition. So that sometimes the text itself is unstable. And they were always leaving out things and adding new things.
Okay, so now I think we can have questions. Any questions from the audience? Yes. Sorry, could you introduce yourself?
Mic. There's a mic over there. Go and give. Just be with the mic.
This is Mahmood Nawaz from Delhi, Mustaqbil newspaper. Arvindji, translation, however good translation may be, mostly at times it falls short of doing justice to the real work of, original work of writing. So do you agree with this view?
The translation falls short of
doing real justice to the original work of writing.
Yeah,
however good they may be.
To be very honest, I mean, this is what I have written in the introduction to The Absent Traveller. So that the translator shoots to kill. And that's my principle. You just destroy the original. There's no original after that. What you have is the translation.
It's a new work of...
No, it is. People will forget the original. Just as we don't know what Omar Khayyam wrote. All we know is Fitzgerald. And that's one great example of the translation replacing. So I really work to replace the original. That's my...
If I can just add that you can afford to do that because your language is a power language. When you are translating, we shouldn't always think of translating into a power language. We can also think of translating, suppose when you are translating from English into Maithili or from Russian into maybe Moog, a language in the northeast, then you do not replace the original. So the power equations have to be kept.
No, the power equations, I'm saying the writers in English are the Dalits of Indian literature. And I hope this is taken on board. I'm saying we are without a journal, without publishers, without magazines. We are looked down upon by everyone. I'm saying we are really at the bottom of it. I'm saying we are really the untouchables. And so how an untouchable can be in a position of power is one of the great mysteries of living in this country.
Okay, I have been asked to take one last question. So can we have three quick... It's all right. Okay, two. There are 3 hands up there, I can see.
Oh, okay.
4 hands up there. Very quickly if we can have them. 5, God.
We are also outside.
Yes.
We are not right outside.
Very quickly, if you can just ask your question.
No, actually part of my question, what was going to be my question, the concept has already been touched upon. I was just going to say that English is a hegemonic language, not just in India, but all over the world. And you were suggesting that, and Farooq Sahib has said that author's permission is necessary, but for old poets obviously it's not feasible and not possible. But
what is the question? What is the question? Because we have 3 more people. Okay, so we'll discuss it later. Yeah.
Okay.
Very quickly.
Yes, it's a question. See, I found one translation of Bala Sarkar's Mitchell done in Marathi. Now we all know the modern language he was writing, and the language which was used was the language of the old Marathi theatre. It just didn't match, with that. Now how does one safeguard against this? It's an overall problem of the approach. Now who's the controlling authority? It's a general question.
Okay, why don't we just quickly take the questions? Do you want to quickly ask?
I'll just make a very quick comment. Any language is hegemonic. It's our complex towards that language that creates the hegemony that we impose on ourselves. So that's what I'd like to say. English is not a hegemonic language. We, sitting here in the subcontinent, how we look at English language writers, English language poets, how we undermine our writers writing in other languages, that is the hegemony. That is in our minds.
And I really, that wouldn't come into my... No.
I think we know that consciousness. Would you want to say
Time out.
No, I don't think you need to worry about that. Is the author's problem. It's not the translator's problem.
Just a parting shot of the translator. If you're not competent, don't translate something. Because don't blame the author that, this translate does not read well because, it's supposed to be a translation, it tried to capture the original outcome. That's bullshit. you try and do the best. A translation should be a work of art, like the original. And if you don't like something, don't translate it. But don't blame the source language or the original text that you're doing a bad job because of that.
Absolutely. So finally, I think what one needs to remember is that translations are never perfect. But let's just go ahead. I mean, language is not perfect. Our thoughts are not perfect. Life is not perfect. Let's just. Sorry?
Novels are not perfect.
Novels are not perfect. You are not perfect. So fine, let's just go ahead and do what we can and be happy with it. Thank you.